So we're dealing with this, Ian, would you mind pulling that one back a bit? Because I know I'm going to be on my back. I'm going to hit my head, which I'm not allowed to do, right? Okay, put it back. Yeah, that's good. Okay, where are we? Spiritual DNA profiling. Identifying the church by its DNA. The true church by its DNA. Probably some of you have heard, I'm sure of it, you're online, and some of you might have even done it, checking your DNA to see where your roots are from. Ancestry.com, have you heard of these places? And there are other places that you can actually pay 40 or 50 bucks, and they will send you a kit. You take a swab and you get some saliva from your mouth and you put it in a tube and you send it to them, and they guarantee you that when they get that they can actually tell you where your ancestors are from, and on and on and on. Until Marketplace decided to recently do a investigation into this and how accurate it is, and I was watching it, and it kind of blew me out of the water. They actually I think they might have done with several people, but they took a set of twins, and they did it with a set of twins on 5 different sites, and the twins did not get all the same results. If it was based on DNA, they would have got the exact 100% same results. And so after consultation and looking further and looking at the fine print, which we don't read, right? How many of you read the fine print? Come on, all right? We don't read it. When you look at the fine print, they actually state on all of these sites that this is based on, what's the word I'm looking for? It's not based on your actual DNA, but it's based on statistics that are entered, and you do the comparison, and it looks like you might be, right? And on and on and on. And they interviewed individuals who are scientists who deal with the DNA from universities and level whatever else, and all of them had to say that this is not based on science, but it's based on statistics. And so therefore, if you like doing that sort of thing, go for it, have fun with it, but don't necessarily believe it, because it's not 100% accurate. As a matter of fact, sometimes it's far from 100% accurate. If you've already done that, sorry, I just spoiled it for you, because you probably wasted your money. But anyway, it's just the newest fad that's out there, and the newest gimmick to get the almighty dollar. So we're looking at the DNA of the New Testament church, and we're looking at the modern day church throughout the world, and we're doing a comparison to see if we are really what God designed the church to be. So we are actually looking at Jesus' building program that he launched just before his crucifixion in Matthew chapter 16, verses 13 to 19. I'm going to read it for you quickly this morning. When Jesus came into the region of Caesarea Philippi, he asked his disciples, saying, "Who do men say that I, the Son of Man, am?" So they said, some say John the Baptist, some Elijah, and others Jeremiah or one of the prophets. And he said to them, "But who do you say that I am?" Simon Peter answered and said, "You are the Christ, the Son of the living God." Jesus answered and said to him, "Blessed are you, Simon Bar-Jonah, for flesh and blood did not reveal this to you." He didn't get into Ancestry.com and try the flesh and blood, but he actually heard it from where it says here, but my Father who is in heaven revealed it to you. Can I tell you something this morning before I even move any farther from this? If you and I want to be what Jesus wants us to be, and if you and I want to see the results that we see in the New Testament church, that you and I need to hear not from man's wisdom, but from God's wisdom. And I also say to you that you are Peter. And on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. So we're taking a look at the spiritual DNA of the church, spiritual DNA profiling. My purpose behind doing this, and this started about a year ago in my spirit as I worked my way through this, my purpose is to pursue the phenomenal growth of the New Testament church, because it was phenomenal, and of the third world, other places in other parts of the world, and the lack thereof in North America. Why the church in China has had at least a 12,000 to 15,000% growth in the church. 1949, 70 years ago, Mao Zedong became the president of China and introduced communism to China, and his first goal was to get rid of all churches and all Christians. He expelled all of the missionaries, and the church, they say, at that time was about 1 million strong. And since that time till today, the church now stands at somewhere between 120 million to 150 million Christians in China. How did that ever happen? Wow, that is amazing. Yet we go to Canada. An article I saw recently on the CTV News on August the 7th, 2017, from sacred to secular, Canada set to lose 9,000 churches. What a difference between a 12,000 to 15,000% growth to actually shrinking. What's wrong? Spiritual DNA profiling. I read an article, it was a quote that came from a book, and I referenced it in my sermon 2 weeks ago, and I told you that I had ordered it, and I got it come within a couple of days after that. I haven't had the time yet to sit down and look at it and read it, but I'm looking forward to reading this. It was written by David Pratt. It was the chairman of the Southern Baptist Missions Board, and he wrote a book called Radical. Now that kind of scares us when someone gets radical. But that was the title of the book, and I loved the quote, and then I looked at what the book was about, and I said, I got to get that, and I've got to read that, because actually we need to get a little bit radical here in North America. He said, we desperately need to explore how much of our understanding of the gospel is American, and how much is actually biblical. How much is American? How much is actually biblical? I'm rehearsing just a few things from my last sermon very quickly. Matthew 6:18, Jesus said, and I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. 2 weeks ago, I said I'm not going to be focusing on what Jesus said first, but I'm going to focus on what Jesus didn't say. How many of you have ever heard something repeated only to find out it's not what the person said? Have you been there? I have. How many of you have actually listened to something being said and spoken or responded to it, and the person looked at you and said, how in the world did you get that from that? When you have hearing problems like I do and some others of you do, that becomes a standard, it seems. I never could understand why my father would misquote us so many times, until now I'm aging and my hearing is leaving me, and I'm getting things all wrong that I hear because it's not what was actually said, because I'm hearing it wrong. So we're focusing on not what Jesus said, but first of all, what he didn't say. This one verse has become the foundation of the church as we view it today. But what exactly did Jesus say? And have we been misled on what he actually meant? When he said, and I did this a couple of weeks ago, when he said, on this rock, and we see it here from the Amplified, what did he mean by the rock? I tell you, you are Peter. The Greek word Petros, I'm quoting the Amplified Bible, are a large piece of rock. And on this rock, the Greek word Petra, a huge rock like Gibraltar, I will build my church. In early church history, from around 300 AD forward, the understanding had been that Jesus was saying the church is built on Peter, thus derailing the church from its original context. But a look at the original Greek, as I said 2 weeks ago, will dispel that. By the way, actually the English word church didn't exist at that time. Keep that in mind. Looking at Peter, Jesus said the first rock, he's using two different words here. The first rock he's using, and he refers to Peter, and he calls him Petros. And it means a piece of rock. But when he repeats the word rock, he uses a different Greek word. He said two different words in the same sentence. He used the word Petra, which means, from Strong's original Greek, a mass of rock. Here it says a huge rock. And many believe that he's looking at Peter, he's saying, you are Peter, as if I were to speak to Ian. You are Ian, you're just a little rock, you're just a little fish in this. But upon me, and he's referencing himself, Jesus, but upon this rock, this is the rock, the great rock, I will build my church. And I gave you a scripture that makes this very clear. I don't know how it ever got missed back then. Actually, I'm going to show you it was on purpose. In 1 Corinthians chapter 10 and verse 14, the word Petra, Jesus used again in a reference to himself, or Paul used in a reference to Jesus. And all drank the same spiritual drink, for they drank of that spiritual rock, Petra, not Petros, Petra, that followed them, and that rock, Petra, was Christ. So the church is not built on Peter, but the church is built on Christ. But that is not the issue that concerns me the most. That is an important one, but many of us have gotten beyond that one. But I want to address another misunderstanding a little further on in the verse, a more serious one I had. More serious, why? A misunderstanding has derailed the church from its God-given mission. I will build my church. Another word that we totally misunderstood, and our misunderstanding is as dangerous as the previous one, if not more serious, and it is that word church is not what Jesus said. Jesus didn't say he was building a church. Now don't get me wrong, and I made this very clear, and I'm not going to stay here for very long this morning, but I believe in the church. I have no problem with the word church when we use it in the proper context. Can I say this morning that you are not in a church? You are in a building. This is not a church. In our culture, we call this a church. But do you know that there are people that are meeting in all kinds of places? And actually, some of them are in prison. Some of them are in all kinds of places where people are coming together as a body of believers to worship God. And they are as much in a church as what we are. Because this building is just a building. But can I say this morning, I'm looking at the church. You are the church. So what really is church? Go back to the scripture again. And I also say to you that you are Peter, and on this rock I will build my church, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. So this morning I want to spend a few moments talking about this word church. I will build my church. Now language is very important. And the original language is, of course, very, very important, because it's from there that we find out what was really said. But can I say something else this morning? It's not just language that we use to interpret something, but it's also context. Context sometimes changes the meaning of a word. I'm going to put Ruth Draper on the spot this morning, and I'm going to ask Ruth Draper to form a sentence for me that uses, and I want you to use one word in that sentence. That's the word squish. Say something with the word squish.
I'm going to squish my granddaughter.
You're going to squish your granddaughter. All right? Now, I'm a Newfoundlander. When Newfoundlanders get together and we say something is squish, it means something totally different. We would say we're going to squeeze an orange. You know, I squeeze the orange. I know that's not proper grammar. I squeeze, we should say I squish, right? But that's not what it means. But what it means for a Newfoundlander is my frame from my computer, the picture that's there is actually a little bit squished. Donna knows that, right? So, are you the only Newfie I got here this morning? And Dorothy, right? Yep. Okay. It's squished. And, you know, if I walked into your house and the picture on the wall was, as you would say, is off level, is askew, right? To a Newfoundlander, we would say, you mind if I fix your picture? It's a bit squished. All right? Now, I'm saying all that to say this. Context is very important. So, I could say something is squished, and then you turn around and say, you know, I can't believe that he actually squeezed that. And actually, I'm not even talking about squeezing anything. I'm talking about correcting something. So you can make an all different topic. You can make me guilty of saying something I didn't say. Squish. Say it. Squish. Yeah. Squish. What is that? Squish. Say it again. What is it? Squish. It's squish. All right? In case you're going to do a holiday in Newfoundland, get used to the language. All right? If someone tells you that it's squish, now you know what they're talking about. Okay? Context is very important. Sometimes the context of a spoken statement can alter the correct interpretation of the words spoken, as I just illustrated to you. So the use of the word squish for a Newfoundlander means something is askew, it's off level, it needs to be straightened up. And for you, it means something totally different. So if I use the word squish, you have to understand where I'm from and how we talk. We do talk a little bit different sometimes, right? And on and on and on. Now, I want to give you a little history as we talk about the church. And when I was in school, and I actually found this when I was in Bible school, my most hated subject was history. I hated history with a passion. I love math. How many of you love math? How many of you hate math? Right? My worst subject was history. Well, I'm going to give you a little bit of history this morning for a few moments to put things in context for you. Up until 1526, the Bible was only written in Hebrew and Greek. And the laity couldn't read it. So they were dependent on the church leadership to read it and also to interpret it for them. This gave the church, by church I mean the religious institution. That's what a church is in our culture. It's a religious institution. And so the religious institution, the power to control and manipulate people. Now, all of us has got that within us. We love to be in control. If we could call the shots and have everything go our way. This is not only just in my home, but it's in all of our houses. What you have for dinner or supper is dependent on who's say it? Who's cooking it, right? Because they're going to cook what they want. And we love to be in control. So this gave the church, by church I mean the religious institution, the power to control and manipulate people. And then came along William Tyndale in 1525, who actually translated the first English Bible. Well, most of it. He didn't get to finish it. But most of it he translated. Now, there were some other parts of Europe that, from what I read in history, there were some people who had actually written some of it in English, but it was never published. But Tyndale was the first publisher to publish a Bible in English. Now, I want you to get this. In the late 14th century, the leadership of the church and the country, because you see, if you can keep people ignorant, you can stay in charge, right? So the leadership of the church, and also like whoever the king was, as long as you can keep people ignorant, you can control them. And so they passed a law in the late 14th century that if you were caught with an unlicensed possession of Scripture in English, unlicensed meaning you had to be a scholar and had to have a permit and had to have a license to do it. If you were caught with an unlicensed possession of Scripture in English, the penalty was the death penalty. What I'm preaching this morning, I will be marched to the gallows as I walk out the door. I'm not kidding this morning if I was back then. He actually lost his life over this translation, and it was strictly because of several English words that upset both the Church of Rome leadership and the government leadership of his day. The king was upset by it. Actually, it was one word is at the core of the issue, and it's this word church. That is the major issue of the day. And let me give it to you in Tyndale's original writing. By the way, for those people who get caught up in the King James Version, and I was there one time, King James is it. Yes, we would use the phrase, that's what Paul used. Paul the Apostle. We know it's not. It's an interpretation from the original Greek and Hebrew, and I don't know why I thought this. I guess maybe because I don't like history. I didn't pay attention in church history, that I didn't learn some things that I've learned in this past year that I'm going to relate to you. Where am I? The King James Version. If you had to actually read the King James Version when it was written, you'd look like a fool because of the language, because English was just developing. All right? So this is the actual writing, and this is what got Tyndale in trouble, was Matthew 16 and 18. I want you to see this morning in its original context. This is how they talk. You talk about Newfies talking funny, right? It's developing. And I say also unto you, thou art Peter, and upon, they eventually became upon, okay? Upon this rock, I will build my congregation. Wow. And the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Eric, you use that word sometimes back there, against. And you use that in Africa. That's old language from back there. It's just cluing in on me. All right, because we have our little things that we do in Newfoundland as well. And so anyway, this is how he interpreted the word ecclesia. The word interpreted church is the word ecclesia, which doesn't mean church. Actually, as I said, until some hundreds of years later, the English word church was invented. It didn't exist back then. So ecclesia is the word in the original Greek, and so the Greek lexicon says it means a gathering of citizens called out from their homes into some public place and assembly. In a Christian sense, this is from the original Greek, in a Christian sense, an assembly of Christians gathered for worship in a religious meeting. It's got nothing to do with an organization. It's got nothing to do with a building. It's got nothing to do with an institution. So Tyndale's translation was the first English Bible to draw directly from the Hebrew and the Greek text, first one to be published at the beginning of the Reformation. And as I said earlier, the laity of the day were denied access to the Bible, and it was still in the Hebrew and Greek, which only the clergy of the day could understand. And I might add, it was purposely left that way. They wanted to keep it that way. So the first English New Testament was published in 1526 by William Tyndale, and he refused to change on the order of the church, and actually maybe even the order of the king himself, because it was a threat to the kingdom as well. He refused to change the word church, congregation, in Matthew 16 and 18 to church. He was betrayed by church officials. In 1536, he was defrocked in an elaborate public ceremony and turned over to the civil authorities. They bound him to a stake with the emblems for fire, and they actually choked him to death first, tying around his neck a rope that took his life, choked him to death, and then they burnt his body in front of everybody. And the message was this: if you play with the Bible, if you are going to call it a congregation, this is what's going to happen to you. What a lovely church. Isn't that what Jesus started? Not exactly. So we're looking at spiritual DNA profiling. I've got to move fastly. The ecclesia, by the way, is not a threat to political leaders, but the church can become a threat. The church can become political. They were in that day and even today, as we look at the church in China. And you see, we have the state church and the underground church. The state church is the church. The underground church is, to use our language, as church, but it is actually the ecclesia. All right? I want you to get that this morning. J.D. Greer, I read this quote that said, the early church had no building, no money, and no political influence. And they turned the world upside down. Isn't that amazing? Then came King James, who said, now we will finalize and have an actual Bible in English. It will be my Bible. It will be the King James Version. It's the beginning of the Protestant Reformation, a breaking away from the traditional church of Rome, but it still wants to keep the status of being a church institution. It became the Church of England, a religious institution with a political influence. 1604, King James appointed 47 scholars to translate the Bible from the Hebrew, Greek to English, completing it in 1611. But few people know this, and I actually didn't know this until this year. I didn't learn this in church history. Few people know this, that King James ordered the scholars not to follow in Tyndale's shoes and substitute church with congregation or assembly, though the latter with a proper interpretation for the word, the Greek word ecclesia. But he refused. Actually, I think that somewhere around 15 edicts were given to the scholars on what you can't do because it will be a threat to my kingdom. So as you write the King James, you can't use this or you can't do that. And one of them was the actual interpretation in the original context for ecclesia was an assembly or a congregation of people. But you can't use that because you will discredit the church and also the control that we have in the kingdom. So the question that begs our attention this morning is, what really is ecclesia? What is it? I'll give you some background. Background on Jesus' declaration here. He's on his way to Jerusalem, where he will be betrayed and crucified. This is, his last days. He stops at Caesarea Philippi. According to verse 13, this is where they stop. It's here that he makes this declaration, and it is no coincidence he chose this place. I think it was very intentional. This place was the very seedbed of anything and everything that's anti-God. Spiritually and sinfully, it was one of the darkest places of his day. And we will note in verse 18, Jesus said, "And the gates of Hades shall not prevail against it." Now, I always thought that was strictly a reference to hell itself. But he was actually looking at a real place that existed, that bore that name, and still does to this day. You go to Google, you put in the gates of hell, and it's still there. A place called the gates of Hades. That bore that name and does to this day, a sinful, depraved place where all kinds of satanic, occultic, sexual practices and idol worship took place. And by the way, in my research, I discovered that the United Nations, as one of their main bases, is actually built on top of Mount Hermon, right above the gates of hell. I didn't know that before. Isn't that amazing? You think about the Antichrist, you think about the UN, you think about all that goes with it. Where they decided to establish this place was right where the gates of hell are. Now, by the way, the gates of hell is not active like it was back then. There were all kinds of things that were demonic things that took place in that day. So it's here that Jesus makes this declaration, all right? I want you to picture him. He's in Philippi, Caesarea Philippi, and he's standing before his disciples, and he's pointing to an actual place that's right there. So get that. Upon this rock I will build my ecclesia, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. Why did he choose ecclesia? Because when I found out what ecclesia means, it started to bother me. He had other choices to draw from. He could have used the temple. That could have been his blueprint for the new church under the new covenant. He could have used the synagogue, and it would have looked today much like say the word? A church. Right? This is the modern day synagogue in the United States. Looks a lot like a church. He could have used that as his example, but Jesus instead, which he often did, choose a secular entity, and my question is why? And look at the history of this word. Ecclesia will help us understand what Jesus really meant when he said he was going to build his church. I thought that ecclesia was something like a new word. Every year there are new words added to the dictionary. So he's about to do something new. He's going to build his church. There had never been a church before. Now he's going to build his church. And so it's going to be the ecclesia. And in my ignorance, because I didn't take time to look it up and to study it and whatever else, I didn't realize that this term was not something new to them. That's why I did the little Newfoundlandese thing with you. You'd have to understand the context. Centuries before the New Covenant was written, the Greeks were using this word ecclesia. I didn't know that before. And I was thinking it was a new word just invented by Jesus as the church is launched on the day of Pentecost. That's not the case. Let me quote an article to you from Greg Simas, Ecclesia Emerging. Said, in the days of Jesus, there were three main institutions in Israel. The temple, the synagogue, and the ecclesia. That was the three main institutions of the day. Now, most are familiar with the temple and the synagogue because they are religious institutions, but know very little about the ecclesia. The temple and the synagogue were religious institutions organized to worship and instruct God's people. But the ecclesia was not religious in any way, shape, or form. It was a governmental If this was in Canada, it would be something that Trudeau had put in place. All right? Did you notice he's tampering with, controlling Christians? It would be the ecclesia. It was first developed by the Greek hundreds of years before Christ and expanded by the Romans when they took power. So the Romans set up an ecclesia. So every city, every town had an ecclesia, and we're going to see what that is in a moment. Cody Archer, in rediscovering the original ecclesia, said this group was made up of about 6,000 men over the age of 18. The ecclesia was gathered around the Roman emperor or king, whichever was. This was their purpose. I want you to get this. To hear and record his words. Then they were to see that his will and desires were being implemented across the kingdom. That was the ecclesia. They were appointed in every city and town wherever they met. I want you to get this. They represented Rome. They represented the emperor. And they had the backing of the entire Roman Empire behind them. If you were voted in to be part of the, or appointed as part of the ecclesia, say there were 3 of you and you met together, and I oppose you, you had all of Rome behind you. As Jesus stood there in the darkest place on earth, so full of the demonic, I know this is a little heavy, so full of the demonic, so dark, that they say that a Jew would never go empty to the place. And this is where he announced his building program for his kingdom. And on this rock I will build my ecclesia, and the gates of hell shall not prevail against it. He's looking at the secular ecclesia and using it as a blueprint of what his ecclesia will be like. That's amazing. He often did that. When sin was in the church, and the church was accommodating sin, Jesus did the same thing. He took something that they did commonly on a daily basis. They would make bread. How many of you like bread? I love it when my wife makes homemade bread. And I can't wait when it comes out of the oven for her to exit the kitchen. Because when she exits the kitchen, I don't know what you call it, but in Newfoundland we call it the bomb. You know, right? And it's hot. And I slice that off really thick, or like a good Newfoundlander thick. Really thick. And then I take butter. And I put it over it and it melts, and that's the best time bread ever is. But you see, there's something that my wife puts in the bread that makes more bread, and that's yeast. And the Bible calls it leaven. So Jesus wanted to illustrate to the church how if you accommodate sin, you actually are not just that person that's contaminated, but you contaminate the entire body. Remember, he said a little leaven leavens the entire lump. These are the kind of things that Jesus did time and time and time again. He used something common that they could identify with. And now he is announcing his building program, and he's looking out, and he can see, maybe he can see the meeting on a corner. And he's pointing at them and said, listen, that's the ecclesia. This is what my ecclesia is going to look like. Now, folks, this gets really good. This really excites me. You'll have to forgive me. I know it sounds boring, but this really excites me. He's looking at the secular ecclesia, and he's using it as a blueprint of what his ecclesia will be like. And now this puts Matthew 18 and 20, the next verse, in context for me. You see, in the Roman ecclesia, if 2 or 3 of the Roman ecclesia were to gather together on a street corner in a meeting hall at their official Tim Hortons, to have a meeting like we do sometimes, to do the business they were commissioned to do. They had the backing of the Roman emperor and the entire Roman Empire behind them. It was as if the king was there in person, and they had all the backing of all the power of Rome behind them. So what happens when 2 or 3 of God's, Jesus' ecclesia meets together? Matthew 18 and 20, I love this. For where 2 or 3 are gathered together in my name, I am there in the midst of them. Wow! That's the ecclesia, folks. When we say Jesus was in the house, he actually was. I don't know if you remember the song or not, but we used to sing in church not that long ago. Jesus is here. Jesus is here. You remember that one? All things are possible. Jesus, sing it, is here. Jesus is here. Jesus is here. All things are possible. Why? Because Jesus is here. Do we believe that anymore? Maybe we are not defeating the gates of hell because we are not operating as the ecclesia, but simply following history and operating as a church and not the ecclesia. Therefore, we do not have the backing of God's ecclesia behind us. But when we do, wow, it's powerful. We can gather even in the darkest places on earth, and we have all the backing of King Jesus behind us, all of heaven behind us, and now verse 19 becomes a reality for us. But unfortunately, this is real in the third world and doesn't seem to be for us anymore. And I will give you the keys of the kingdom of heaven, he said, and whatever you bind on earth will be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth will be loosed in heaven. That's what he said to his ecclesia. If you become the ecclesia, let me go back and quote Cody Archer, rediscovering the original ecclesia again. He said, this is how we as the ecclesia are called to function. I'm talking fast because I got lots and I got to get this over with. This is how we as the ecclesia are called to function as rulers under the supreme ruler, King Yeshua. We have been called out from the kingdom of darkness to gather around our King in nearness and intimacy. And get this, same as the earthly ecclesia, we are to hear his voice. And as scribes who record his will and plans and strategy, we do our own strategizing. That's our problem, folks. We don't take it from heaven anymore. But if we listen to him, then under his authority, in partnership with him, we are commissioned to obey and act upon what we have heard in his presence. And then he quotes Matthew 18, verse 18 to 20, which is the Great Commission. When we go out as the ecclesia, we have the backing of heaven behind us, and there's not any demonic power that can stop us. There is nothing that can come against us, folks, this morning when we stand in the name of Jesus. And that's what the New Testament church did. Listen to what the Bible said about them as Diana and the team comes back. Let me close with this. Paul and Silas are on a missionary journey. They are in Thessalonica, preaching Christ in Acts chapter 17, verses 2 to 6. When you look at the DNA of the New Testament church and you see how the church operated and the miracles they did and all that happened, it's amazing. Then Paul in verse 2 says, Acts 17 and 2, then Paul, as his custom was, went in